happy that I could be here today. And I hear the rain, and I keep thinking about a couple years ago when we had about 3 feet of water in our basement, and that was every basement in our neighborhood. And then that rain stopped and the water started to go down, and it started again. And we thought, well, we can't get it all cleaned up yet. And Alan was asking for videos to be recorded. And I'm thinking, I am not touching any kind of electrical equipment that's wired down into the basement. But on top of that, I've lost so much material. Workshop material, special toys for preschool students and students with special needs with whom I work. A lot of my storytelling paraphernalia, craft items, books, clothes. And so I wear a bracelet that I bought then, because the floods weren't over. We had one more after that. 3 floods in about 5 days. The bracelet says, blessed. And I thought to myself, no matter what has happened, no matter what happened in the neighborhood, no matter what's happening this year, no matter how hard the rain falls, I woke up this morning. It's a good day. I woke up this morning and my heart was beating. It's a good day. I woke up this morning and my heart was beating on its own and I remembered who I was. It's a very good day. So no matter what happens in your life, in some way, you're blessed. I was blessed to come from a storytelling family and a family filled with love. My great-grandparents, with whom I stayed every summer in East Liverpool, Ohio, were a beautiful example of love. They'd get up early in the morning and work in the garden together, and when I was there in the summers, I was to help them. And as we worked in the garden together early in the morning, before we'd had a meal, my great-grandmother might start to sing something, and I was supposed to sing my part too. And she might be turning the soil or planting new seeds or pulling up weeds, whatever she was doing. She would be singing something like, "Oh, Mary, don't you weep." And I'd have my part, "Oh, Mary, don't you weep. And Martha, don't you moan. Oh, Martha, don't you moan. The river drowned no Pharaoh's army. Mary, don't you weep. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. And Martha, don't you moan. Oh, Martha, don't you moan." And there were verses to this, and I didn't realize what a heritage I had. But one time my great-grandmother, Great-Grandma Essie doll, I called her, was singing that particular song. We got to that last part, which I was supposed to close. And she looked at me as we were working in the garden, and instead of singing it the way I would usually sing it, it went kind of like this. And Martha, don't you moan. My turn. Oh, Martha, don't you moan. I was about 5 years old. My great-grandma said, "Baby, you singing kind of Baptist today. We're Methodists." And I didn't know what that meant, but I had one grandma who went to the Baptist church and one grandma who went to the Methodist church and a great-grandma who went to the Methodist church. A family of love, and it didn't matter where you went, you had to go to church. Now my great-aunt Kat lived right next door. Houses so close together, you could open up the dining room windows and climb from one house into the other. I knew, because I'd done it, and scared my great-aunt Kat half to death, and she gave me what was then called a whooping. But when my Uncle Stafford met her, He said he immediately fell in love. He wasn't a romantic kind of guy. But my great aunt Kat said that he told her, I must marry you. I must. And I may not be able to give you everything you want, but I'll always give you everything you need. And she said she knew he was the one to marry. And they were together so long, I never imagined that they'd ever been young, because they were old when I was little, and they were old when I was older, and they were always in love. Even though I hear them fussing through those dining room windows, you'd hear her voice, and you'd hear his voice. Shut up, yo. And he laughed the way you did. And he said, you old, but you're still cute. And then there was my Grandma Josephine and my pop-pops. And it's said that a good woman can pray a man into heaven. And that might be my grandfather's blessing, because he would get himself in trouble. We won't get into all the details. And some folks called him a tall tale teller, but Grandma Josephine said he was just a liar. And when she'd ask him if he did something, like spitting into one of her pretty little flower pots, because he couldn't find the coffee can into which he spit his tobacco, or breaking her punch bowl just before a Sunday church dinner and just putting the pieces into the trash can. She would say, buy it? Did you break my punch bowl? He wouldn't say yes, he wouldn't say no, he'd say, it's a possibility. And I think she might have prayed him into heaven, because she would pray over him. But it wasn't the kind of prayer that you might think. She'd put out her hands and spread her fingers wide toward him, and she'd say, Lord, give me wisdom. Lord, give me wisdom. Don't give me strength, because if you give me strength, I'm going to kill him. Lord, give me wisdom. And they were together until his death. A lot of love. And when I reached an age where the young men were kind of looking at me, and I was kind of looking at them, and they were kind of smiling at me, and I was kind of smiling at them. Pop-Pops told me a story which turned out to be an old folk tale about the one you might choose and the importance of love. He said there was a girl who lived high on a hill with her mama and her daddy and her sisters and her brothers. They had great wealth. They had cattle, fine fields, a big house. And so a lot of young men decided they were going to do some courting. She was a pretty girl, and her family had all that money. One day, she was sitting on the front porch with her mom and her daddy, sisters and brothers running around, chasing the dog in the backyard, when they heard a wagon coming up the hill. And a young man wearing a red flannel shirt pulled that wagon into the front yard. Whoa, he stepped down from that wagon. He tied the horses to a little tree. He reached into the back of that wagon and pulled out 2 axes, walked over to the front porch, sunk those axes into the front porch step. Cha, cha. Well, Mama said, what in the world are you doing? And Daddy started grumbling like Uncle Stafford. But the girl said, don't worry, Mom and Daddy, I'll take care of this. That young man held out his hand toward that girl, and he said, sweetie pie, marry me. Well, Mama gasped, and Daddy choked, and the girl sent him in the house. I'll take care of this. And she turned to that young man and said, what makes you think I want to marry you? He said, well, I'm a fine carpenter. I make a lot of money. I cut down the trees and I do all the work and I make the most beautiful furniture you have ever seen. I have made a fortune from doing that, and you couldn't do any better than to marry me. And he held out his hand again. But she didn't take it, and she didn't seem impressed. And he wanted to impress her, and he looked around. There was a huge tree near the house. He pulled up those 2 axes, walked over to that tree, started climbing that tree by hitting the axes into the trunk. All the way up he climbed, and when he got to the top, he started cutting down that tree. And as he cut down the tree, he also removed the bark from the wood, somehow planing the wood, and the wood all fell down in the shape of a big chair. And then he dropped into that chair, crossed his legs holding those axes, turned around to see if that girl was impressed. Well, she looked at him and she looked at the chair and she said, "I have nothing to say to you right now. But you come to the dance on Friday evening at the community meeting hall, 7 o'clock. I'll have something to say to you then." And that young man took those axes, threw them back into the wagon, untied the horses, climbed up in that wagon, and down the hill he went. But he was passed by a car coming up that hill, and the car stopped in that front yard. And a young man stepped out of that car. Ooh, he was silky. Black silk suit, white silk shirt, black onyx cufflinks, a black onyx tie tack, and shiny patent leather shoes, shiny hair, and when he grinned, his teeth were so shiny, ding, the sunlight reflected off those teeth and literally blinded that girl. He walked over to her, held out his hand, said, "Sweetie pie, marry me." And she heard her mother and father gasping at the front door. She said, "I'll take care of this. Why should I marry you?" He said, "Well, my family is the second wealthiest in this county. Your family is the first. And if we married, we could combine our fortune. We would be the wealthiest young folks in 3 counties. Besides that, I own land myself. I sell real estate, and I know how to build fine houses that are sold for a lot of money. Marry me." Well, she didn't seem impressed, and he wanted to impress her. And he looked around and he saw a big old chair sitting in the front yard. Well, he went to his car, opened up the trunk, pulled out a toolbox and opened it up and took out a hammer and a little saw and some nails, went over to that chair, tore down that chair, rebuilt it as a small house in the front yard. Well, the girl still didn't seem impressed, but the family's dog came around the corner of their house, saw that thing, whoop, moved right in. The girl said to that young man, I have nothing to say to you right now, but come to the community meeting hall, 7 p.m. on Friday. I'll have something to say to you then." And he put his tools away, closed that trunk and got in the car and down the hill he went, only to be passed by a young man on a fine white horse, a young man wearing a long gray coat. And when he got into that front yard, he jumped down from that horse, straightened up his coat, tied the horse to a little house in the front yard. He walked over to that girl, and you know what he said. "Baby cakes, marry me." Well, she could hear her mother and father going apoplectic at that door, and she said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." "Why should I marry you?" He said, "Well, I'm the best barber in 3 counties. I make a lot of money. I am called to Washington, D.C. sometimes to trim the hair of politicians. One of them's bald, and he just calls me up there to polish up his head. I'm not going to stay in this little place all my life. Someday I'm going to live in Washington, D.C., and you could do better than living here, too, if you marry me." Well, she did not seem impressed, and he wanted to impress her. Now, at that moment, a little rabbit came out from under the bushes on one side of the yard, and the dog in that little house Oh, he smelled that rabbit, and as the rabbit tried to hop by, that dog shot out of that house and started chasing that poor little rabbit around the yard. Well, that gave the barber an idea. He braced himself, and he waited, and when that rabbit was close enough, he snatched that poor little rabbit up by its ears. He reached into one pocket of his gray coat, and he pulled out a shaving mug. He reached in and he pulled out some shaving soap, dropped it into that mug, still holding on to that rabbit. He spit into that soap in that mug. He took out a brush and stirred that stuff up, pulled a razor out of one long pocket, opened that razor, lathered that rabbit, and proceeded to shave that poor little rabbit from the tip of his ears down to his toes. Then he dropped that little rabbit on the ground. Poor naked little bunny rabbit. Rabbit looked kind of confused. But the dog ran up on that rabbit, didn't know what it was, and he went running and hid in that house. Well, the young man looked at that girl to see if she was impressed, and she said, "You just shaved the rabbit." And I don't have anything to say to you right now. But if you come to the dance at the community meeting hall, 7 p.m. on Friday, I'll be there and I'll have something to say to you then. And he put away all his barbering paraphernalia, went over to that horse and untied it from the house, climbed up on that horse, and down the hill he went. Well, 5 minutes to 7, there were 3 young men standing at the front door of that meeting house. Now, other folks were dancing, and the band was playing, and people were eating and laughing and talking, having a wonderful time. But those 3 young men were standing there dressed in their finest clothes, looking at one another, trying to figure out why the other ones were standing there. When the door opened and in came the mother, the father, the sisters, the brothers, and that girl, that cute girl, that rich, cute girl. And she sent her mom and daddy and the rest of the family into the dance, and she looked at those 3 and she said, "I tried to think of what to say to y'all." And all 3 of them realized why the others were there and dropped their open hands. She said, "I think the easiest thing to say would be, no, I'm not going to marry any one of you. But let me tell you why. You, Mr. Carpenter, you cut down one of the oldest trees on our property, a tree that was planted by my ancestors, to build a chair that we did not need in the front yard. But you never once acted like you would pull me into that chair, hold me on your lap, and show me you loved me. You, Mr. Landowner, real estate, wealthy man, you tore up a perfectly good chair and built a house we didn't need in the front yard. Now the dog won't go into his house in the backyard. He figures that he should live there. You built a house, but you never once acted like you would make a home with me. And you, Mr. Barber, you shaved the rabbit. There ain't nothing I can say about that. But there's another thing. Y'all called me things like honey lamb and sweetie pie and baby cakes, and I knew you were hungry for something, but I don't think it was my love. I think it was the family's money. And so I suggest to you that the next time you want to do some courting, you at least learn a girl's name first. My name is Catherine, by the way. That's what you can call me. And I will not marry any one of you. And she went into the dance to enjoy the time with friends and family, while those 3 young men went home a little sadder, but a lot wiser. And that girl went on home with her mama and her daddy and her sisters and her brothers. And because she had common sense and good learning from her family. Whether she married or not, she lived not the way folks say you live in fairy tales. She lived as best she could. And may we all be able to do just that with our blessings. Thank you for listening.